Welcome back to Chop for Time. We are sitting down this week talking about last Sunday's message, which would be yesterday. We talked about Exodus chapter 4, and we're going to talk about it some more here on Chop for Time.
Well, did you guys have a good weekend? Anything exciting going on?
Spent all day Saturday at the house. It was nice. We had a couple, we weren't really snowed in, but I mean, we got about 8, almost 9 inches of snow over at the house. Yeah. So, we had a couple projects that needed to be done inside the house. So we would work a little bit, then watch a show and eat, and then work a little bit again, watch a show and eat. So it was a good day.
Very cool. Yeah, the snow was weird. Like there was a lot of snow, but the roads weren't actually all that bad. It was quite a fluffy snow that didn't seem to get too icy, which was nice. We were supposed to go skiing, and I thought it was really ironic that we had to cancel our ski trip because of the snow.
Which one does?
Yeah,
naturally.
I was so ready to go.
Yeah, me too.
I was ready.
It would have been good. But James, what did you get up to instead?
Me and Catherine just hung out, and this past Sunday we went to Bonnie's house, which was awesome, and then we went to your house afterwards. So
I wasn't even there for that.
Yeah,
I came back over here.
Have you all ever experienced I know we all like spaghetti here. That's just kind of a universal like. But have you ever just had those days that spaghetti just hits? I mean, it just hits just right there. And I don't eat spaghetti often, but yesterday we went home and Kim made spaghetti, and dude, I had a mountain of pasta on my plate, it was so good.
This might sound strange, but spaghetti is one of those dishes that I find always gets cooled too quickly.
Yeah,
is that weird to say? Yeah. Anytime I think of spaghetti, I always think by the end of the plate, it's cooled. This is one of my biggest complaints against American culture, that it's not normal to preheat the plates or bowls in the oven before a meal.
No.
That's what we do. Like, if you're having hot food back home, like you have to put the plates or bowls in the oven to keep them warm, and then the food stays warmer for longer. But you can go out to a really nice restaurant and be handed a cold plate with hot food. And my grandmother would be appalled if she ever, she's very by the book.
Interesting factoid.
Other than Trace, which they hand them to you piping hot.
Yeah.
But then the food stays nice and hot for the whole meal.
Flesh, but
And I went to Maline's with my mom the other day, and the waiter came to me and she was like, "The plate's really hot," and I was like, "I know, I can see the steam coming off of it." I was like, "I'm not gonna touch it."
I think that's what I'm just going to start ordering with my order, and I would like that on a hot plate, please.
Yeah, see what happens. Well, anyway, we were talking about Exodus.
Yes.
4. We're going to be talking about Exodus for quite a long time.
Yes.
But yeah, chapter 4. We were actually in service, you only read the first 17 verses.
17. Yeah. Kind of concentrated on the first 10.
Right.
Is really where we spent the majority of our time.
And then we hopped to verse 24.
Yep. Read 24 through 26, I think. Something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do we want to read through that, or do we just want to?
I think we'll save a little. We'll chop that.
I'll stick it on the screen, and you can pause it if you want to read it.
Chop it.
Aha. But yeah, James, was there anything yesterday or anything you want to go over from Ben's message?
Well, I guess I'll just go ahead and. Where's it at? Hold on, because it's in here.
Second book of the Bible. 4th chapter.
Well, no, so 24 through 26, the
like kind of where we ended.
Yeah, where we ended, the circumcision. What is that?
It is a bizarre passage, and it's something that we've talked about in our staff meeting before, because I can't remember what it was, but I remember I was trying to find a passage one time and I just came across, and Christy was sitting there and I was like, "Christy, read this." It's so weird.
It's a weird passage, and we were at the elders meeting last night, and they even, a couple of them even indicated that, hey, we were kind of surprised that you went with that. But it seems like a random, really weird, really cringy story that just shows up.
Yeah, it's very out of the blue.
Yeah. But when you look at it, and you really, especially, we kind of themed this chapter yesterday about obedience. because we see so many different elements of obedience, whether it be private, whether it be public, whether it be corporate. This is all about obedience. And Moses is on his way to Egypt to free, the Israelite people. And along the way, God just decides, I'm going to kill somebody. I mean, and that's one of those questions you're just like, whoa, you're talking about saving people and bringing them out of slavery, and all of a sudden we're talking about killing someone? And then you get to looking into the passage, and turns out, because we go back to Genesis 17, and that's the story where God makes the covenant with Abraham. And while it's cringy, while it wouldn't be the covenant that we would make, God says the evidence of this covenant is the blood portion of it is going to be the act of circumcising all of the male Hebrew children. Doesn't make sense to me. I don't get it. I wouldn't choose it, but I'm not God.
Right.
But what we find in this passage of Scripture is that Moses hadn't kept that part of the covenant with his sons. And we don't know if it was God was going to kill Moses for not keeping it, or kill his firstborn, Gershom, because he wasn't circumcised. We don't know that.
Well, it's interesting because you were saying that, and I was looking in the Pew Bibles, the ones that are actually in the church, and it just straight up says Moses, but with little parentheses around the name, and then at the bottom, obviously in the footnotes, it says, or Moses' son.
Yeah.
But it wasn't like a B that it normally does, or an A or a letter. It was like there was little brackets around it. So it's like almost just an assumption at that point.
I was thinking, I was like, well, if God just called Moses to go and set his people free, like he wanted Moses specifically, like he went to the middle of nowhere to find Moses on the mountain. I was like, I have a really hard time finding why God would kill the one who he had just called by name to kill him. I mean, it's not like God can't do it himself, but it's like he wanted specifically Moses. So I was like, I have a feeling he was going to kill his son, but it could be Moses. I don't know. Like, that's one of those things where it's just not clear.
We could sit and ask questions about this all day. It's like, why did he let him get mid-journey to do this? Right. God knew about this before he even appeared to Moses in the bush. Why didn't he ask him to take care of it then? Maybe God was hoping, maybe God was giving Moses the opportunity to make right this wrong with already having the private acts of obedience and Moses being like, okay, there's a little something that I forget. If I'm going to be the leader and the deliverer of the Hebrew nation, maybe I should follow, like the most important part of being a Hebrew, the covenant that we have with God. So, I mean, there's so many questions here that we just don't have concrete answers for, and we could talk about that all day, all of those questions. But the fact of the matter is he was raising him as not a Hebrew. We don't know if it was a Midianite, if he was raising him as an Egyptian, but we know that he wasn't being raised in the Hebrew tradition and culture. So he wasn't being obedient to God. Yeah. And disobedience isn't going to stand before God.
Wasn't it like a certain age when you had to circumcise your kids? I can't remember what it was.
It's really young. It's like the 8th day or something like that.
Yeah, so like Gershom, if that's how you say his name right, probably wasn't a young kid at this point either.
No.
So that
could have
been.
He was born at the end of chapter 2, right?
Yeah. And then there's
a long time passes.
Yeah. So this is another one of those that we are just kind of making a supposition here and a speculation that he is at least in his late teen years and maybe possibly older.
Yeah.
Which adds to the weird cringiness of this story.
It reminds me of I was looking in Acts when Paul first finds Timothy and starts discipling Timothy, and he circumcised Timothy. So like that Timothy, like it wouldn't hurt his witness against other Jews and stuff like that. For some reason, I don't know why it reminds me of that, but it's just like that. I think even more than this one, I was like, did Paul really have to circumcise Timothy? Like, was it necessary? Like, I guess, if Paul found it necessary, then okay, but like that poor Timothy. Like,
Yeah, it is a bizarre thing. But you also pointed out that Zipporah was the one who actually
Yeah.
saved the day,
Yeah.
a non-Hebrew,
Mm-hmm.
non-part of the covenant,
Right. New.
or like brought into the covenant, I guess, through marriage. But
Right.
like,
Right. And we don't know how Zipporah knew. We don't know
Yeah.
if there was an interaction between she and God. We don't know if it was
Yeah.
just being married to Moses and being
Right.
somewhat aware of the customs and the covenant.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
a lot of questions.
yeah. But for the rest of the passage, the sort of 1 through 17, you pointed out the three. What was it you called them? Like the
Signs.
mhm.
yeah, you had a phrase for them. Opportunity for obedience or something. You were talking about something for obedience.
The private obedience.
Private, yeah. I just lost it. My book closed. And you were saying that there was a couple of people reached out and said that they found it interesting. A couple of the little details, like the
Yeah.
snake.
Yeah, the
And the
symbology
headdress.
behind it, right.
Yeah, in that, like, God was saying that he was sovereign over Egypt
Mm-hmm.
as well as Moses and his people, which I thought was pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to see that take off a lot more.
Yeah.
Like, this is just kind of like a starting point into
Yeah.
that type of thing.
God is. I don't think that God is proving himself to Moses here. I think that this is definitely testing Moses's obedience.
Mhm.
But we have to understand that Moses was raised an Egyptian, and even though that he was a Hebrew, knew the ways of the Hebrew nation and knew about the God, Yahweh.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know how closely at this point. We don't know how personally that his relationship with Yahweh is. But what we do know is that he had 40 years of history, roughly, in the Egyptian culture. So he would have been very well aware of what the headdress meant.
Right.
What happened when that headdress with the cobra with his hood open, what that would have signified, what that it would have been Pharaoh taking on God's status and him being sovereign and all-powerful. He would have known the bout that they had with leprosy and the plague that was that they could not solve, that they could not cure or treat. So, Moses, this was definitely a test of obedience, but maybe it was also an increasing revelation of God's nature, that he was just told, I am who I am. But he was also saying, and I'm going to show you what I can do.
I wonder, like, whenever, so they put because the picture you showed on Sunday was King Tut's coffin
Yeah.
of what
What's his full name?
King Tukut. I can't say it right.
Tutankhamun.
Tutankhamun.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's his coffin that they found him in, and plus, like, it had the snake and everything on it. I wonder, like, whenever. I wonder, like, was there only specific times that the Pharaoh wore it? Because but since it was only specific times, like when Moses went up and did this in front of Pharaoh, like proclaiming, like, hey, like, you're not really sovereign, like, I can do the same thing, because God's given me the power to do it. Like, I wonder if Pharaoh was wearing that when he did it, which may be more than why God
In the movies, he was.
Yeah,
So,
which I always wonder,
So
like,
obviously.
yeah.
like if that's why God told him, when you go to Pharaoh, do this, because he might have been wearing it. I don't know.
Right. And regardless of whether he would have had the headdress on at that point or not, the cobra was,
Right, the symbolism is
Right,
still there.
Yeah.
right.
They
Yeah.
still would have known either way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Which areas did you end up chopping?
Well, let's take a little bit of a different approach to this,
Okay.
because there was a comment made to me afterwards, and one of the things that that we've done, I will ask you guys this little pop quiz on the spot here. Which of the 5 themes do you think that we see in this passage? The one or which themes? Because we look at the themes of God keeps His promises, God's promise or God's presence never leaves us, God reveals His nature to us. There's a theme of liberation from bondage, and then God having this restorative power, this redeeming and redemptive sacrifices. What do you think we see here?
I say we see multiple ones in this one. I think it might be the first 3 you named.
Okay.
So faithful, keeps his promises. I can't remember the first 3 you named, but I know the ones that you named, there's multiple ones that we see here.
Okay. So, go.
I'd say almost all of them. I would struggle to see the last one. What was the last one
The
again?
redemptive sacrifices.
Yeah, the sacrifices. But I mean, it's definitely not a stretch to pull them all in.
Yeah. And the reason I said we're going to take a little bit of a different approach to this is James and I were having a conversation after service yesterday, and he said, as we're following along, because one of the things that, kind of asked James to do was sit down with the book of Exodus in your internship and arrive at 30 messages, the entirety of the book, which is insanely challenging. To do that.
Yes.
And you made a comment, and I would like for you to kind of expound on that just a little bit. You said as we were going through that you were looking at chapter 4, and you were looking at the different sections of it, and you're going, oh, okay, I can see he chopped this. Mm-hmm. I can see why he did this and this. I'd be interested to hear that as far as from a chopping block standpoint.
So I remember at the very beginning of the sermon you said because I'm starting to be able to know what you chop when you're preaching. I was like, he could spend a lot of time on this, but he chose to 2 sentences and skip over to his main point. But I realized, like, when you're talking about Moses being like, so he's talking to God, and Moses is like, I don't want to do this. You have somebody. I can tell he chopped that. Mm-hmm. And I made a reason maybe like why you chopped this, because that's so familiar to us. Like so familiar, but you did hit on it again later on towards the end of the sermon, where you was like, we have the same tendencies as Moses, and like whenever God calls us to do something, like we tend to shy away, we tend to make excuses. But then you really pretty much just hit us dead in the face when you was like, if Christ has called us all to spread the gospel, He's called us all to go and serve. But if you're a Christian in here and you don't do that, then you're in danger, because that's blatant disobedience to Christ, and He's our general, He's our king, and you don't just blatantly disobey the king and get away with it. And then I feel like another thing you chopped was you went from 1 through 17, but then you skipped all the way down to 24, 26. And so I was like, okay, you skipped a good portion. But then a question I was going to ask you about what you skipped is, whenever Moses goes to Jethro, why, if God's already told him just go to Egypt, why does he have to go to Jethro to get permission to go to Egypt? I was looking at that, I was like, why does he have to go to Jethro to get permission? Like, Jethro has no, at least in my head, maybe I'm wrong, probably am, but he doesn't. God has the highest authority here, so why go to Jethro? What's the need for that?
Well, it's an honoring of those in authority over you here on earth. Basically, he could have packed up his bags and taken the stance of God told me, so I don't care what you think. But there is an honor system, and we see that throughout the Old Testament with people going to others, and Nehemiah. Going back to restore Jerusalem, the wall around Jerusalem, he goes to the king. Mm-hmm. So there's an element of honor. There's also an element of provision that goes along with them, because Jethro, his father-in-law, would have sent provision and people and his daughter and his grandchildren. So there was a patriarchal element to this that Moses was being very honoring in the culture. Because God didn't ask, God didn't tell him, go get your father-in-law's permission, but there was a cultural honor of the patriarchal element there.
Yeah. Also, like we see at the start of chapter 3, is that like Moses tended Jethro's flock. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if that means he worked for him, but it's at least polite to say, hey, I got to go. You need to find somebody else to look after your sheep. And
if he would have just left right then that would have been a large portion of the flock, which sustained the family, sustained, and it would have been a large family, most likely, just wandering in the wilderness.
Yeah.
And yes, Jethro is the same father-in-law as what we're introduced in chapter 2.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we never really mentioned that a few days ago, but it is really interesting is that he's given the name Ruel at the end of chapter 2. And then chapter 3, all of a sudden, he's called Jethro.
I think he's like one of the people in Scripture, because a lot of times when people's names change, especially when God changes them, it doesn't change back. So when God like changes Abraham's name from Abram to Abraham, he's never called Abram again. It's always Abraham. Jacob's always called Israel. Sometimes God refers to as Jacob, but still it's Israel. But why is it that his name goes back and forth? Like his name like doesn't consistently say Jethro. It's either Ruel or Jethro. I know it's the same person, but I kind of noticed that.
I've not researched that, but it could be very much just the language differences. It's been Ruel and the Midianite tongue.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah, and the Bible Project podcast had a series on kingly priests or priests in general, and I remember they had an episode on Jethro. I didn't actually listen to it, but I'm sure they probably have a whole bunch of nerdy stuff that might not matter, but would be very interesting to know.
Yeah. The thing with Moses is kind of waffling back and forth, making the excuses. Like I said, we come off of chapter 3, and God has just told him basically everything that's going to happen. And it's like it didn't even register with Moses.
Right.
So God goes into the signs. And when we talk about signs, we're not talking about magic tricks here. Okay, we're not talking about illusion, optical illusions type things here. A sign, especially in the biblical sense of it, is something that points to a greater reality, something that points to something greater than itself. It's like if you're, let's say we're going to go on a road trip to Willard, which would be a major
Exotic.
undertaking, right? We don't just pull up, as we're headed that way, we see a sign that says Willard. We don't just stop at the sign. Well, we made it. We've got to go to Judy's, man, which is a little convenience store there, which is the hub. Okay, we got to go to you. You're in Willard when you go to Judy's. Okay? It's not just the sign. The sign's pointing you to a greater reality, and that's the same thing with So
Right.
God's like, okay, I told you what was going to happen. Now I'm going to give you some signs because you're obviously not getting it. And then in verse 10, it's just such a sad reality thing, man. Moses, it's worded differently, but it's the same concept.
I know something that you kind of touched on a little bit was after he's made these excuses and he's like, "Well, I can't speak. I'm slow of tongue." And then God's like, "Hold up a second." He's like, "You just called me Adonai, which is sovereign one. So if you just called me that, knowing the significance behind what that means, and then like, okay, if you believe that, Moses, then who made the mouth? Who causes you to speak? Who puts the words in your mouth?" He was like, "If you just called me Adonai, then you can't turn around and say I can't speak because I'm gonna make you speak. I made your mouth." So then he almost like refutes what he says and then says, "You have no excuse."
Yeah.
Like I as soon as you said that, I was like, okay.
Yeah. And I mean, even in this passage, we already see, I hesitate to say issues, but God having some issues with Moses. Because it's, before we get to the place while they're on their way, and God's about to kill him or his son or someone, we see that it says that God's anger was kindled towards Moses.
Well, that's at the point where Moses has already made a couple of excuses, and then he's eventually just like, "Please just send someone else."
Yeah. It's like
Isn't that
Aaron. We've got Aaron.
Verse
here.
13, he's
Yeah.
like, but Moses said, "Pardon your servant, Lord, please send someone else."
Yeah.
Just like, all my excuses are done.
Yeah.
I just don't want to go.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we'll see this, and the reason we didn't go too far into that is not necessarily because I chopped it or didn't go into detail because of the relevancy of it, but we're going to see this becoming a theme in Moses' life. So we'll see this kind of revisiting throughout this story. Because again, we look at these, and your statement of it's not about the heroes of the Bible, it's about the hero of the Bible. We look back, David, Moses, these biblical giants, and we look back and go, man, they were just so awesome. And as we study their characters, like, man, they were the worst.
Yeah.
And we're going to see that with Moses. It wasn't just like Moses had this epiphany moment. It was just everything was smooth sailing from that point on, and he did everything right. So we're going to see that struggle as we go along here.
I can't remember who it was. It may have been Chandler or someone that said it, but I've kind of thought this too, like throughout reading the Old Testament, is like, why do we try to model ourselves after these dudes?
Mm-hmm.
It's like David, in some aspects, was awesome, but he also killed a guy and slept with his wife. Samson was horrible, and Moses wasn't really much better. Moses killed a guy, but the only reason God didn't kill him was because God wanted to use him to bring his people out of Egypt. So it's like, why do we model ourselves or try to model ourselves after these guys when they're just as messed up as we are? So like, that's why, like, I love when you said, like, on your sermon, Thomas, when you was like, we shouldn't, why are we so focused on the heroes when there's only truly one true hero?
Yeah.
And
Which is especially clear, I think, through Exodus as a whole. I think it's one of the primary themes of it, that the people keep messing up.
Yeah.
But God doesn't. Like,
Right.
He stays the
Well,
same.
if we're recognizing Jesus as the greater Moses, I think the reason why we kind of gravitate towards people like Moses is because that's a simpler justification for us. It's like the standard of Moses is much lower. The standard of being like Moses is much lower than the standard of being like Christ.
Yeah. The other thing that we didn't talk about was the last 5-ish verses, and that's sort of 27 through 30?
Yeah.
31.
Yeah.
Which is like Moses actually encountering Aaron, and then Moses and Aaron going and speaking to the people.
The elders.
Yeah, the
they've
elders.
made it.
Yeah.
They've arrived in the land of Egypt, and they have gathered the elders, and they've told them what God is
Right.
getting ready to do. We did. We'll kind of, the way that we
Do a
kind
bit
of
of a recap.
recapped the last few verses of chapter 3.
Yeah.
Next week, we'll recap the last few verses of chapter 4, kind of to set the scene
Right. Before we go into
before
chapter
we
5.
go into chapter 5. Yeah.
Very cool.
Because they're now in Egypt. Things have already gotten really interesting, but they're about to really take off.
Pick up.
here.
Yeah.
yeah, I can imagine, like, I wonder if when Moses came back to Egypt, I wonder if anyone, like, besides his own people, if any of the Egyptians recognized him, or if he was so old at that point where he obviously didn't look anything like he was when he was there the last time. Like, I wonder if any Egyptians were like, he's back. Like, it's
I'm
Moses.
sure that there were some. Yeah.
But I can imagine the fear that he had going in there.
Oh,
Yeah, for sure. Are there any other areas that we
No.
want to cover?
No.
Cool.
That's
So next week is chapter 5.
chapter 5. We are going to talk about disappointment in moments of hope
Okay.
instead of moments of hope in times of disappointment.
Okay. Interesting.
So,
That sounds cool.
yeah.
Exciting. Well, we will be back here next week. Oh, I just bumped the microphone.
Just put it wherever
it's
you
fine,
want.
it's
That's fine.
fine. My camera has died.
Okay.
Hang on. I'm gonna talk to this camera. We'll be back again next week for Chop for Time because my camera died.
See ya.
See ya.